March 24, 1945, over Berlin, Germany. The air is thin and trembling with engine roar. 49 B-17 bombers crawl across the upper sky, their silver bellies glinting in the morning light. At 27,000 feet, the air temperature is nearly 50 below zero. Every sound is muted by oxygen masks, every thought narrowed to survival. Below them, flak. Black blossoms erupt across the pale blue, each burst marking the rhythm of death. And above the bombers, moving in formation so tight their wingtips almost touch, fly the red tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. Their P-51 Mustangs shimmer in the sunlight, red painted tails cutting through the cold like a promise. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. leads them with unwavering calm. No chatter, no improvisation, only formation, perfect, geometric, disciplined. German interceptors dive from the sun, and every instinct screams to break away, to chase, to fight. But they don't. They hold. Their mission isn't glory. It's protection. And on this day, not a single bomber under their guard will fall. That's how legends are born. Not from chance, but from discipline carved in prejudice and forged in fire. The question is, why did they fly so close when others didn't dare? It began in the uneasy calm before America's entry into World War II. The year was 1939. Europe was burning. Hitler's armies had rolled into Poland, and Britain stood bracing for invasion. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched, preparing reluctantly for a war that seemed inevitable. But inside America's own ranks, another battle simmered. One not of nations, but of race. The U.S. Army Air Corps, soon to become the U.S. Army Air Forces, was segregated to its core. Black men could serve as cooks, drivers, or laborers, but not as pilots. Aviation was deemed a white man's domain, a field requiring intellect, coordination, and leadership. Traits that racist doctrine claimed African Americans lacked. The belief was unscientific, baseless, but deeply institutional. Yet beyond the walls of Washington, a new generation was rising, men and women who refused to accept that the skies themselves could be segregated. Civil rights leaders, journalists, and organizations like the NAACP began pressing for inclusion. Political pressure mounted. The irony was impossible to ignore. A nation preparing to fight fascism abroad still practiced its own version at home. It was in this tense atmosphere that President Franklin D. Roosevelt, under mounting pressure from activists and black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, authorized the formation of an all-black flying unit in 1940. The plan would later be formalized under the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a small, cautious step cloaked in bureaucracy but monumental in meaning. The training site chosen was Tuskegee, Alabama, deep in the Jim Crow South. There, at the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university founded by Booker T. Washington, the Army would establish a flight school. It was meant by skeptics to be a contained experiment, to prove quietly and definitively that black men were not fit to fly combat missions. But what began as an experiment would grow into defiance. In July 1941, the first aviation cadets reported for duty at Tuskegee Army Airfield. They arrived from across the country. Students, mechanics, postal clerks, dreamers. Many had never even sat in an airplane before. Yet they carried themselves with the calm of men who knew the odds and refused to accept them. Under the watchful eyes of white instructors and the pressure of politicians waiting to see them fail, they began the grueling process of becoming military aviators. Every maneuver, every takeoff, every landing was a statement of existence. They were not just learning to fly, they were dismantling prejudice, hour by hour. Among them was a quiet, composed graduate of West Point, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the U.S. Army's first black general. Davis carried an air of unbreakable restraint. At West Point, he had endured 4 years of silence, his white classmates refusing to speak to him outside of official duties. Not once had he been invited to a table, not once to a conversation. Yet he graduated 35th in a class of 276. His weapon was discipline. That same discipline would soon define the airmen he would lead. By late 1942, the first class had earned their wings. 99 pilots, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, stood ready. But still, the War Department hesitated. Would they fight? Would they even be trusted with frontline combat? The answer came slowly and painfully. When the 99th was finally deployed to North Africa in 1943, they were met not by cheers, but by suspicion. Commanders doubted their capability. Other squadrons refused to integrate or share facilities. Even General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, had once questioned whether Negroes could fly in combat. The Tuskegee Airmen's fight had 2 fronts, one against the Luftwaffe and one against their own country's disbelief. But in that crucible of skepticism, they built something the Army hadn't expected: unity. They trained harder, flew tighter, made no mistakes they could afford to, because one failure wouldn't just ground a pilot, it would ground a race. Their legacy was taking shape, forged not in triumph, but in tension, and soon the war would come calling. By spring 1943, the war in Europe had turned into a grinding aerial siege. The Allies bombed by day, the British by night, and the skies over Italy, France, and Germany had become killing fields of steel and smoke. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed every capable pilot it could get, even those it had doubted. In April that year, the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first group of Tuskegee-trained pilots, was sent to North Africa. They arrived in Tunisia under the blazing desert sun, assigned to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Montmirail. Their aircraft, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, rugged, reliable but outmatched by German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. From the start, they faced scrutiny sharper than flak. Montmirail doubted their readiness, criticizing their performance in early missions despite their limited numbers and aging aircraft. Every sortie was dissected, every loss exaggerated. When other squadrons stumbled, reports cited fog or enemy superiority. When the Tuskegee pilots struggled, it was called proof, but the men of the 99th didn't falter. In June 1943, they achieved their first confirmed aerial victory. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall downed a German FW-190 near Pantelleria. His calm radio transmission, "I got one," became a symbol. It wasn't just a kill. It was vindication. As the Allied campaign pressed into Sicily and Italy, the Tuskegee Airmen continued to escort bombers, strafe enemy convoys, and defend Allied positions. Slowly, the narrative shifted. Their discipline, once mocked as rigidity, became their strength. While others spread out chasing kills, the Red Tails held formation, prioritizing mission success over personal glory. That philosophy, "Stay with the bombers," came directly from Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. When he took command of the 332nd Fighter Group in 1944, he imposed a code that was absolute. No bomber under their protection would be left alone. They would not chase German fighters into the clouds. They would not scatter for personal kills. Their job was to defend, no matter what. It was a tactical choice born from moral necessity. The white bomber crews they escorted didn't trust them at first. Some even refused to fly with colored escorts. Davis knew that one mistake, one abandoned formation, could destroy the fragile confidence they'd begun to earn. So he drilled his men until their formations were geometric perfection. Their Mustangs, the sleek, fast P-51s that replaced the older P-40s, became extensions of that discipline. With their newly painted crimson tails, they stood out unmistakably in the sky. It was both a target and a badge of honor. The red tails became legend not for flamboyance, but for precision. By mid-1944, the 332nd Fighter Group was flying deep penetration escort missions into the heart of Nazi Germany, Berlin, Munich, Vienna. They flew hundreds of sorties, guarding bombers against elite Luftwaffe units. Their discipline frustrated German pilots, who couldn't lure them away. Their tight formation made them harder to isolate and destroy. Other American units called them rigid. But the bomber crews, once skeptical, began to notice something remarkable. When the red tails flew cover, fewer planes went down. Word spread across the 8th and 15th Air Forces. If you see the red tails, you're safe. That reputation was earned through sacrifice. The Tuskegee Airmen lost men, like Lieutenant Lee Archer's comrades who never made it home, but they never abandoned the code. Their tactical unity became both shield and symbol. The Army began to take notice. Commanders who once questioned their competence now requested them by name. General Davis's leadership reports circulated through Allied headquarters, highlighting the unit's consistency and low bomber loss rates. By late 1944, the 332nd had proven itself among the best in the skies, but their fight was far from over. Behind the statistics and glowing reports lay the same battle they had fought from the start. To be seen, not as exceptions, but as equals, and as the war neared its climax, the Red Tails were assigned their most dangerous mission yet, an escort deep into the Nazi capital itself. The date was set. March 24, 1945, Berlin. The mission that would test everything they had built. The sky was both battlefield and proving ground. But for the Tuskegee Airmen, it was also something deeper. The only place in 1944 where they could be truly free. Above the clouds, rank and race meant less than instinct and discipline. Up there, in the roar of the Mustang's Merlin engine, they weren't colored pilots. They were warriors. Yet on the ground, the contrast was brutal. At their bases in Italy, they lived in segregated camps, ate in separate mess halls, and endured taunts from fellow servicemen who refused to salute black officers. In nearby towns, they were admired by Italian civilians who didn't share America's racial codes. It was a surreal duality. Heroes abroad, second-class citizens at home. Still, that humiliation forged something powerful. It gave their mission meaning beyond victory. Every flight became an act of quiet rebellion, a statement of equality written across the sky. Many of them carried letters from mothers and wives who reminded them, "Every man you bring home alive is proof that we belong here." Their emotional resilience was matched by tactical discipline. The Red Tails didn't fly like anyone else. While most Allied fighter groups favored fluid, aggressive maneuvers, loose formations designed to hunt and destroy enemy aircraft, the Tuskegee method was exacting. They flew tight, wingtips almost aligned, lead and wingmen moving like a single living organism. It required trust, the kind built through relentless training and absolute obedience. But there was purpose behind that precision. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. had drilled into them a single creed. Your job is not to chase glory. Your job is to bring those bombers home. He knew that other groups often abandoned their bomber formations to pursue enemy fighters, leaving the heavy planes exposed to counterattacks. The Tuskegee squadrons refused. When Luftwaffe aircraft attacked from above, they held formation, intercepting without scattering. Their discipline frustrated German aces, who relied on chaos to isolate and destroy. In battle reports, bomber crews began describing them as always there. That simple phrase became the Red Tails' calling card. Not a boast, but a fact. While others claimed more kills, the 332nd Fighter Group claimed trust. Every mission was a balancing act between restraint and aggression. The temptation to pursue enemy planes was ever present, a test of pride and patience. But Davis's men understood something most didn't. War wasn't about how many you shot down. It was about how many came home. And that discipline, born from both strategy and survival, would soon make them legends. Their human endurance and tactical precision were only half the story. The rest was found in the machines they flew, the leaders who shaped them, and the moral code that bound them tighter than any formation in the sky. The machine that carried them into legend was a masterpiece of engineering, the North American P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it was powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, capable of escorting bombers deep into Germany and back. With its bubble canopy, high speed, and long range, it was the perfect balance between elegance and power. But for the Tuskegee Airmen, the Mustang was more than a weapon. It was a statement. When their aircraft were painted with red tails and red nose markings, it wasn't initially symbolic. It was for squadron identification. Yet soon, that splash of crimson became their identity. Bomber crews learned to look for those red flashes above them, and Luftwaffe pilots came to recognize them as opponents not to be underestimated. Watch out for the red tails, German pilots warned one another. Inside the cockpit, however, the technological beauty of the P-51 could only be mastered by a mind sharper than its machine. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. embodied that discipline. His leadership style was calm, deliberate, mathematical. He didn't inspire through charisma. He inspired through consistency. Davis demanded perfection. Pre-flight briefings were precise, his debriefings colder than steel. He punished recklessness, rewarded control, and expected excellence not for fame, but survival. "We cannot afford mistakes," he told his men. It wasn't rhetoric, it was arithmetic. In a segregated army, every loss carried double weight. His authority was absolute, but it was never cruel. Davis knew the weight his men carried. Not just the risk of dying in combat, but of being erased in history. To lead them, he built a doctrine where pride and restraint became indistinguishable. The men followed not just because he commanded them, but because he embodied them. Under his watch, the Red Tails' moral code became as unbreakable as their formation discipline. They would not engage in revenge attacks, not strafe civilians, not abandon comrades. In a war often defined by chaos and cruelty, they clung to a higher standard. For them, discipline wasn't just military, it was moral armor. Even their enemies noticed. After the war, several captured German pilots described the Red Tails as unusually professional, a quiet compliment from foes who respected few. They were different, focused, unshakable. Behind those calm eyes and crisp flight suits was something the enemy couldn't see: the burden of representation. Every decision in the air carried the weight of history. Every mission was proof to a country that still doubted them. So they held formation. Always, because to break it, even once, would be to confirm every prejudice they had spent years defying. And as winter turned to spring in 1945, that discipline, human, tactical, technological, moral, was about to face its final and most dangerous test. Berlin awaited, a city in ruins, a sky filled with death, and the Red Tails flying straight into its heart. March 24th, 1945. Early morning, Ramitelli Airfield, Italy. The air was cold, still, and heavy with silence. Ground crews moved like ghosts beneath the winged silhouettes of 51 P-51 Mustangs lined in perfect rows. Mechanics tightened bolts, checked fuel, and wiped frost from red-painted tails that gleamed faintly in the dawn. At 8 hours, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. gathered his men. The target was Berlin. the heart of the Third Reich. They were to escort the 15th Air Force's heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, bound for the Daimler-Benz tank works at Spandau. The mission would take them deeper into Germany than any Tuskegee unit had ever flown. Intelligence reports warned of heavy flak over the capital and intercepts from the Luftwaffe's elite, including the new Me-262 jet fighters. For the Red Tails, this was the ultimate test. Engines roared to life, shaking the frozen tarmac. The Mustangs began to roll, their wingtips gleaming like polished blades as they lifted, one by one, into the thin blue. Beneath them, the bombers gathered into columns that stretched miles across the sky, a formation of silver giants escorted by a wall of red. The flight north was calm at first. Thin cloud cover, steady oxygen flow, and the hypnotic rhythm of propellers turning in perfect sync. Each pilot sat alone in a metal cocoon, separated from the world by glass, altitude, and purpose. Then came the warning over radio. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. German Me-262 jets, the world's first operational jet fighters, dove from altitude, streaking across the sky at near supersonic speed. The difference in velocity was astonishing. Conventional dogfighting was impossible. The bombers were sitting targets. The instinct for most fighter groups was to break formation, scatter, and pursue. But not the Red Tails. Colonel Davis's voice came over the radio, calm, almost steady. "Stay tight. Protect the bombers." They turned into the attack, climbing in unison. Their formation, so tight it had once seemed restrictive, now became a fortress in motion. The Me-262s slashed through at lightning speed, overshooting their targets, unable to maneuver within the Red Tails' disciplined wall. As one jet looped back for another pass, Captain Roscoe Brown of the 100th Fighter Squadron rolled his Mustang into a perfect intercept arc. Timing it by instinct, he squeezed the trigger. 50 caliber rounds tore into the German jet's fuselage. The Me-262 exploded in flame, spiraling down through the clouds. Another followed moments later, downed by pilot Charles Brantley. 2 jets destroyed by propeller-driven aircraft that were supposed to be obsolete. The bomber crews, watching from above, would never forget the sight, the crimson tails holding fast while chaos reigned. "They never left us," one B-17 gunner later recalled. Not once. For hours, the Red Tails guarded the formation through the flak-riddled skies over Berlin. Black smoke rose from burning refineries below. German anti-aircraft guns thundered, filling the sky with shrapnel. But the Mustangs held their line, escorting the bombers to target and home again. By mission's end, nearly all of the 650 bombers returned safely. None lost to enemy fighters. In military reports that evening, the 15th Air Force recorded it simply, "Mission accomplished. Escort performance. Excellent." But among the men who flew that day, something deeper was understood. It wasn't just a mission. It was vindication. Years of doubt, prejudice, and condescension had been answered not with words, but with action. 1,600 miles round trip, 0 losses. That day, over Berlin, the Tuskegee Airmen cemented a reputation that would echo through history. And yet, even as they touched down on the runways of Ramitelli, wiping oil and sweat from their faces, few realized what they had truly done. They hadn't just protected bombers. They had proven, beyond dispute, that discipline could defeat both prejudice and superior technology. Their legend was born in that silence. In the space between duty and recognition, the hydro sun was beginning to set over the Adriatic when the Red Tails returned to base. Ramitelli Airfield glowed gold in the fading light, a place of dust, exhaust, and weary triumph. One by one, the Mustangs landed, trailing thin ribbons of smoke from overworked engines. Ground crews ran out to meet them, counting as each red tail touched down. None were missing. For a few moments, there was only the sound of cooling metal and the ticking of instruments. Then came the quiet realization. Not one bomber had been lost under their protection that day. The radio crackled with confirmation from command. All escorted bombers accounted for. It was more than a statistic. It was a line drawn across history. Over the next hours, messages filtered through Allied channels, fragments of praise, disbelief, and quiet awe. B-17 crews sent word back to Ramitelli, "Best escort we ever had." Pilots and gunners who had once doubted them now swore by them. "If I see red tails on my wing," one wrote, "I know I'm coming home." The reports climbed up the chain of command. General Nathan Twining of the 15th Air Force commended Colonel Davis and the I 302nd Fighter Group for their extraordinary discipline and efficiency. Davis accepted the commendation with his usual composure. Expression still, words precise. There was no celebration, no boasts, only acknowledgement that their duty had been done. But among the pilots, something unspoken passed. They knew what they had achieved wasn't just military. It was moral. Every man in that unit had carried the invisible weight of proving his worth to a nation that had doubted his existence. And on that day, in the skies over Berlin, they had carried it flawlessly. Their zero-loss record became a legend almost overnight. Newspapers back home began to take notice. The Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier printed front-page headlines, celebrating the Red Tail Angels. Letters poured in from black families across America. Mothers thanking the men who had shattered boundaries. Their sons could now dream. Beyond, the official record would later reveal that over the full span of their escort missions, the Tuskegee Airmen lost 27 bombers, fewer than any other fighter group in the theater. But numbers were secondary to perception. To the air crews who returned home alive, the Red Tails never lost one. That legend, the zero-loss myth, was born not of error, but of reverence. The bomber crews believed it because they had felt it. The Red Tails' presence meant safety, and that emotional truth became more powerful than any ledger entry. As spring turned to summer, the war neared its end. The Luftwaffe collapsed, Germany's cities burned, and Allied air superiority became absolute. Yet the Red Tails continued flying their missions, still disciplined, still measured, even when victory seemed certain. They had learned that precision wasn't a tactic. It was identity. Colonel Davis watched his men taxi back from each sortie, the red tails gleaming in the Italian sun, and he knew what history would remember. Not the bitterness, not the prejudice, not the bureaucratic battles that had nearly crushed them, but the flight lines, the calm discipline, and the unbroken formations slicing through hostile skies. Their unity had become a symbol larger than war itself. In every way that mattered, the Red Tails had done what no one thought possible. They had fought racism and fascism at the same time, and defeated both with the same weapon, discipline. And as the final, missions of April 1945 closed the book on the air war in Europe. San Trithidur Sansu. Their legacy was sealed not in the number of kills, but in the number of lives saved. The world would soon learn what they had accomplished, but recognition would come slowly, painfully slowly. Because when the guns fell silent and the airfields emptied, the Tuskegee Airmen returned to a country still unwilling to salute them. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For most Americans, it was a day of unrestrained celebration, parades, confetti, homecomings. But for the men of the 302nd Fighter Group, victory came wrapped in silence. At Ramitelli, their airfield in southern Italy, the Tuskegee Airmen received word of Germany's surrender through the crackle of a radio. Some smiled faintly, Others simply stared across the runway, at the red tails lined in the sunlight. Their war finished, their mission complete. They had flown over 15,000 sorties, destroyed or damaged more than 260 enemy aircraft, sunk a destroyer, and earned hundreds of medals, including 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Yet, when the orders came to return home, there were no fanfares waiting. On arrival in the United States, they were met not by honor guards, but by segregation lines. At many bases, the same racial barriers they had left behind in 1943 still stood. White officers received priority for debriefings, promotions, and transport. Black pilots were told to wait, their heroism reduced to footnotes, in a war that was already being rewritten. But their records spoke louder than any silence. The U.S. Army Air Forces compiled the after-action reports from hundreds of bomber crews. The data was clear. The 332nd Fighter Group had the lowest bomber loss rate of any escort unit in the 15th Air Force. While other groups averaged 3 to 5% losses per mission, the Red Tails rate was less than 1%. For a military obsessed with precision and efficiency, that statistic was undeniable. General Henry Hap Arnold, the same man who had once doubted the capability of black pilots, personally commended Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. for outstanding leadership and combat effectiveness. In that moment, the military establishment was forced to confront a truth it could no longer ignore. Excellence had no color. But Davis accepted the praise without triumph. He knew what awaited them beyond the airfields, a return to a divided America. Even as the Tuskegee Airmen's reputation spread through military channels, resistance persisted. Some commanders attributed their success to limited exposure or luck. Others refused to credit them in official communiques. Yet, among the bomber crews who had flown under their protection, there was no doubt. One letter, written by a B-24 C-24 pilot to his wife in May 1945, captured the sentiment best. They said the colored boys couldn't fight. But I tell you, honey, if you ever see red tails above your head, you thank God, because you're coming home. Such words carried further than medals. They traveled across bases, through barracks, and into the press. By the war's end, the Red Tails were known not by rank or squadron number, but by their reputation, the angels of the sky. In 1947, 2 years after victory, the U.S. Army Air Forces transformed into the independent U.S. Air Force. Within that same year, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the armed forces. The decision was not born in a vacuum. The Tuskegee Airmen had laid the foundation, their performance leaving the military with no moral or practical justification for segregation. Truman's order carried the weight of their record. 332nd Fighter Group, combat-proven, disciplined, unbreakable. Their formations had done more than protect bombers. They had dismantled an ideology. Still, recognition was uneven. Many airmen returned to civilian life only to find doors closed, jobs denied, and service forgotten. In uniform, they were heroes. Out of it, they were reminders of a promise America had yet to keep. But history has its own rhythm of justice. The seeds they had planted, of professionalism, courage, and equality, began to take root. The next generation of black servicemen and women would rise upon that foundation. The Red Tails had changed not just how America fought, but who America could be, and yet beneath the triumph, a quieter truth remained. The cost of restraint, the cost of perfection, the cost of proving humanity to a world that had doubted it. For many of the Tuskegee Airmen, peace was more complex than war. In combat, their mission had been clear: protect the bombers, survive the day, prove their worth. In peacetime America, the enemy was harder to define, and the battle never ended. When they returned home, medals on their chests and discipline in their step, many were greeted not with honor, but hostility. In southern train stations, signs still read, "Colored waiting room." Restaurants refused to serve them. Some were even ordered off military bases by white security guards, unaware, or unwilling, to believe that these men were officers. Captain Roscoe Brown, one of the aces who had downed a German jet, later recalled, "We fought Nazis abroad, and then we came home to face another kind of tyranny." The pain was quiet but cutting. These were men trained to control emotion, to suppress anger, to live by the unbreakable precision that had defined them in the air. Now that discipline was turned inward, becoming armor against the injustice of daily life. Many left the service, disillusioned yet dignified. Others stayed, continuing to break barriers within a newly integrated Air Force. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. remained, rising steadily through the ranks. In 1954, he became the first black officer to command a jet fighter wing, the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing in Korea. By 1959, he was a general. The discipline that had carried him through West Point's silent years and the war's chaos had become a lifetime code. But recognition for the unit as a whole came slowly. For decades, their contributions were overshadowed by myths, misreported numbers, and institutional amnesia. History remembered D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, but the story of the Red Tails lingered in the margins, known mostly among those they had saved. Still, legends endure where statistics fade. Among bomber crews, the saying lived on: "Red Tails, safe flight." It passed from one generation of airmen to the next, even when few knew its origin. By the late 1960s and 1970s, as America's conscience began to confront its own racial past, the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy resurfaced. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers began revisiting their combat records. Veterans were interviewed. Men like Lee Archer, Charles McGee, and Roscoe Brown, who spoke not with bitterness, but with the calm clarity of soldiers who had long understood that time, not politics, would vindicate them. They spoke of fear, not hatred, of pride, not revenge, and of a unity forged in the cockpit, a bond that had transcended every attempt to divide them. By the time their story entered classrooms and museums, the red tail of the P-51 had become more than a mark of a fighter group. It was a symbol of collective endurance, of how discipline, honor, and purpose could rewrite history even when history tried to ignore them. The Tuskegee Airmen's zero-loss legacy wasn't just about bombers that returned home. It was about a people who, despite everything, refused to break formation, socially, morally, or historically. Their story, once confined to runways and mission logs, began to inspire new generations, civil rights activists, aviators, and dreamers who saw in those red tails the ultimate proof that excellence, when consistent and quiet, can move nations. And as the last of their Mustangs were retired and their airfields reclaimed by weeds and silence, the formation they had built, tight, unwavering, indestructible, remained intact in memory. They had proven something greater than equality. They had proven endurance. History remembers those who changed the course of war, but some, like the Tuskegee Airmen, changed the course of belief. Their story is not one of miracles, but of method. Tight formations, silent resolve, perfect discipline. In a world that measured worth by color, they answered with precision, line by line, mission by mission, until doubt had nowhere left to hide. The skies they flew were unforgiving, their machines fragile, their nation divided. Yet they never broke formation. Not once. That restraint, that unshakable unity, became their greatest weapon. When they flew above Berlin in 1945, they were not merely pilots protecting bombers. They were citizens protecting ideals. The same hands that gripped the throttle also carried a quiet dream. That courage, once proven, could not be segregated. Decades later, their red tails still gleam in memory, symbols of endurance, equality, and excellence. Their legacy does not rest in the claim of zero losses, but in something purer, the pursuit of perfection when the world expected failure. They showed that dignity needs no permission, that greatness requires no validation, and that the tightest formations are not just flown, they are lived. In the cold, silent skies of history, their contrails still hold their shape, unbroken, unforgotten, forever flying in perfect formation.